Asserting central dominion and opening diagonals for queen and bishop immediately unlocks attacking potential. Mirroring white's advance immediately contests the center's vital square. Developing the knight attacks the central pawn, immediately challenging black's ambitious pawn thrust and preparing to castle. Developing a knight to a central square like this one naturally contests the e4 pawn and prepares for castling, setting a solid foundation. Instigating the Ruy-Lopez, this bishop directly challenges black's knight, setting up potential pins and influencing the center's pawn structure for future maneuvers. Challenging the bishop's influence, this pawn advance forces a decision, potentially freeing the queenside while creating a slight structural weakness. Preserving the bishop's diagonal pressure on black's queenside structure, this tempo gain offers white sustained central influence and potential for swift development. Developing the knight toward the center challenges white's bishop and opens lines for further action. Securing the monarch's safety opens up piece development possibilities for the queenside. Solidifying the pawn structure opens lines for black's pieces, preparing to contest the center. Reinforcing the center and preparing for d4, white opts for a solid setup that gradually builds control. This pawn advance elegantly supports the d-pawn's future journey and offers a subtle restriction on black's kingside development, potentially limiting options for a quick g5 push. Developing the bishop to g4 pins the knight, immediately challenging white's central pawn structure and preparing to disrupt white's harmonious piece development. This creates immediate tactical possibilities and forces white to consider counterplay or a potential pawn structure concession. The tension now shifts dramatically. Asserting central control and initiating a pawn break, white immediately challenges black's bishop and opens lines for their pieces, creating dynamic play. Pushing the b-pawn creates immediate queenside space, forcing the bishop back and solidifying black's pawn chain, though it does weaken the c6 knight's outpost potential by opening a path for white's bishop to target it later. Anchoring the bishop here solidifies the queenside advance, preparing to contest the center more vigorously while preserving the bishop's active diagonal. Solidifying the bishop's protection and preparing to castle, the knight on f6 gains a crucial defender, simultaneously repositioning the dark-squared bishop to a more passive, yet secure, outpost. Challenging the bishop immediately forces black to address the threat and decide on the bishop's future, potentially disrupting their planned pawn advances. Sacrificing the bishop for the knight immediately disrupts white's pawn structure and opens a diagonal for black's queen, potentially creating attacking chances on the kingside. It also signals a willingness to embrace a more open game, trading off a key defensive piece for immediate initiative. Unpinning the knight and claiming central influence, this queen sortie immediately challenges black's pawn structure and aims to dominate the open d-file, subtly reinforcing the initiative. Sacrificing the central pawn structure opens fascinating lines of play, potentially for both sides, but it concedes the initiative in the center for the moment. Black aims to disrupt white's pawn chains and perhaps create attacking chances against the now exposed white king. Reclaiming the queen's influence on the kingside, this move aims to orchestrate pressure against black's castled king, potentially preparing a later attack along the g-file or h-file if the opportunity arises, while simultaneously repositioning the queen to a more active square after the forced exchange. Bringing the queen to d7 aims to bolster the e5 pawn's defense while preparing to castle queenside, which could lead to an unbalanced and sharp middle game. Sacrificing material for kingside penetration, white opens aggressive lines toward black's monarch, aiming to exploit the pawn shield's integrity and the exposed bishop. Securing the king by tucking it away on the queenside creates an immediate imbalance and sets the stage for a sharp, aggressive middle game battle, as the queenside castling often signals an intention to launch pawn storms or open lines against the now exposed enemy monarch. Suddenly, the white queen appears deep in enemy territory, a bold, almost audacious sortie aiming to exploit the doubled pawns and black's slightly misplaced pieces. But this audacious queen sortie could easily become a dangerous trap if not handled with extreme precision, potentially leaving the queen stranded and white's own king exposed to the swift counterattack of black's pieces now that the defensive screen is weakened. Shifting the king to the rookside pawn shield offers a sliver of safety from the immediate storm on the queenside, but it also cedes further control of the c-file and potentially delays kingside development, creating a precarious pawn structure under fire from white's active queen. A bold attempt to disrupt the opponent's defensive setup and seize central initiative, though it potentially opens lines of attack against your own monarch. Protecting the queen's escape route while simultaneously preparing to reclaim material lost through white's aggressive pawn grab becomes paramount as black repositions the queen, a crucial piece whose safety has been jeopardized by the recent exchanges and white's audacious queen sortie. Challenging the center's pawn structure opens up lines for both sides, introducing a dynamic tension that could quickly escalate. Snatching that pawn, the knight ignites a fascinating tactical skirmish, immediately challenging white's central dominance and potentially opening lines towards the white king's shelter. This bold thrust sacrifices pawn structure for immediate activity, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development and create opportunities through piece play rather than immediate material gain. The resulting position will likely become sharp, demanding precise calculation from both sides as the board opens up. It's a declaration of intent, shifting the game's momentum and forcing white to react decisively to the sudden imbalanced piece activity. The knight's journey to c3 aims to contest the d5 square, a crucial central outpost for black's pieces, and prepares to defend the e4 pawn should black decide to push their d-pawn further. This knight also eyes the active squares on the queenside, potentially contributing to an attack or a defensive maneuver depending on the evolving pawn structure. Black's rook finally finds an active square, seizing control of the open file and preparing to apply pressure on white's kingside castled position. A decisive confrontation is reached as white captures the rook, opening a crucial diagonal for the queen and initiating a potentially crushing tactical sequence that might lead to a swift material advantage and an exposed black king. The rook, now liberated from its defensive post, swiftly occupies the open central file, injecting immediate pressure and disrupting white's nascent queenside initiative with its newfound mobility. The bishop now bravely ventures to g4, a daring excursion that immediately targets the undefended rook on e8, creating significant tactical opportunities and forcing black to react decisively to avoid material loss, while simultaneously solidifying white's control over the kingside. A decisive pawn sacrifice now simplifies the material, creating a starkly simplified landscape where the open files and black's rook on the 7th rank become paramount considerations. The rook pawn's advance here, while seemingly gaining material, unlocks the g-file and creates a permanent weakness that can be exploited later in the game. Pushing the b-pawn now ignites a spatial duel on the queenside, potentially liberating the rook from its passive post and creating an outpost for the knight if white isn't careful, while simultaneously creating an immediate target for the h-pawn that could lead to a pawn avalanche. Pivoting the knight to d5 injects immediate pressure on the c7 square, potentially isolating black's rook and disrupting coordination, while simultaneously eyeing the weak d6 pawn and offering a strong outpost for the knight if black doesn't react decisively. A knight on d5 is a formidable outpost, and this bishop's repositioning seems to challenge its dominion, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially prepare for a pawn advance on the queenside. Opening up the h-file for your rook could be a game changer, but exposing your own king to that bishop battery on the diagonal is a serious concern. Seeking a powerful counterplay, black introduces a forcing check, aiming to disrupt white's central grip and potentially gain material or open lines towards the enemy monarch. Protecting the monarch becomes paramount as the battlefield constricts, a subtle repositioning to escape the immediate fork threat and maintain a defensive outpost. The rook, no longer bound to the back rank, now swings into the fray with an audacious flank attack, aiming to disrupt white's precarious pawn structure and exploit the exposed monarch. The white king, exposed on the 3rd rank, now finds itself in an even more precarious position, facing the imminent threat of the knight's check. This king march, instead of shoring up defenses, has ironically opened a direct avenue for black's pieces, creating a dangerous tactical situation. The rook's excursion to the first rank, abandoning its defense of the now-open king file, signals a daring attempt to salvage a difficult position by disrupting white's pawn structure and forcing immediate action. Seizing the open file, the rook now actively hunts black's compromised king, a potent demonstration of how a seemingly static piece can become a dynamic force when granted clear lines of attack. The bishop, now finally free from its pawn chain and the confines of its original diagonal, finds a promising outpost on d8, aiming to participate in the defense of the weakened kingside and potentially harass white's king if it ventures too far forward. The rook now aggressively occupies the 7th rank, creating a significant cramping effect on black's position and threatening to isolate the lone bishop. The black rook's liberation from its defensive duties on the 8th rank allows it to finally participate actively in the battle, now targeting the weakened kingside pawn structure with the intent of creating immediate threats. Re-establishing pressure on the open f-file is a pragmatic choice, seeking to dislodge the black rook from its surprisingly active post and perhaps create a backdoor threat against the isolated white king as the game simplifies. The black king's position is alarmingly exposed, leaving it vulnerable to a swift mating attack as white capitalizes on the open files. Reclaiming the center with that knight immediately challenges black's entrenched bishop and aims to liberate white's pieces from their somewhat cramped positions after the pawn exchanges. Finally, the black bishop finds a more active diagonal, aiming to influence the queenside while white's rook remains somewhat awkwardly placed, suggesting a slight positional imbalance that black might exploit. Asserting control over the critical 7th rank, this rook finds a commanding post, threatening to disrupt black's already precarious defensive setup and potentially create inroads towards the isolated king. Unlocking the central pawn structure, this advance aims to activate the stranded knight on d4 and potentially open lines for a counterassault, injecting dynamism into a position that had become somewhat static after the flurry of exchanges. Initiating a bold rook lift, this maneuver aims to penetrate black's weakened kingside and exploit the exposed monarch. Black is finally stabilizing their structure and preparing to redeploy their rook, aiming to untangle from white's pressure and activate their remaining pieces. Sacrificing the rook like this severs the last connection to your king's safety, effectively inviting perpetual check or even a swift defeat if black can navigate the remaining pieces effectively. Unleashing the d-pawn opens up possibilities, aiming to disrupt white's pieces and potentially create a passed pawn, forcing a reassessment of the board's central structure. Probing the weak d-pawn and hoping to disrupt black's otherwise solid structure, this offers a chance to gain some counterplay by attacking the advanced pawn, though it might also open lines that could benefit the opponent later. A dazzling knight fork materializes, completely disrupting white's precarious king's safety and forcing a cascade of material loss, a truly stunning tactical shot after a period of positional maneuvering. The king's flight becomes a desperate gambit, desperately seeking refuge from the onslaught. But this immediate repositioning, while understandable, exposes the monarch to the very dangers he sought to escape, creating a precarious dance on the precipice of disaster. The black rook, after its daring penetration, now anchors itself, eyeing the vulnerable white king and threatening to disrupt any semblance of defensive order, even as its own king remains exposed. Unleashing a pawn thrust, white aims to gain space and potentially open lines for further attacks on black's exposed monarch, simultaneously challenging the bishop's dominion over crucial diagonals. The pawn's advance on g5 initiated a crucial moment. Black's response, a daring raid with the rook to d2, seizes control of a central open file, simultaneously threatening the pawn and preparing to infiltrate white's weakened queenside. This aggressive maneuvering aims to disrupt white's coordination and exploit the exposed nature of the king, which has been left perilously vulnerable throughout this chaotic middle game. It's a bold play, a gamble to inject life into black's position by forcing immediate tactical calculations. A daring advance, aiming to barricade the passed pawn and potentially sever black's attack by creating a new pawn chain. A desperate king hunt is brewing, with the black knight aiming to disrupt the white king's precarious sanctuary by forcing it into a vulnerable square where it might fall prey to future tactics. The king boldly steps into the storm, a desperate gambit to escape black's relentless advance and seek refuge. Unleashing the knight from its recent sortie, black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially force a favorable exchange or open new lines of attack. Unleashing the pawn's final march to glory, its proximity to promotion now dictates the entire strategic landscape, forcing a reactive defense from black. A desperate attempt to inject chaos into a lost position, this discover's attack offers a brief flicker of hope by targeting white's uncastled king, though the material deficit remains insurmountable given the advanced passed pawn. The king boldly steps into the fray, a daring gambit to exploit the exposed black pieces, and sees an active role in this chaotic endgame. Unleashing a desperate pawn gambit, black aims to disrupt white's imposing pawn chain and potentially create new avenues of attack, hoping to exploit the exposed white king in this chaotic, pawn-heavy endgame where initiative is paramount. The king's perilous dance toward the queenside exposes him to potential mating nets, yet this choice aims to activate white's remaining pieces by opening a path for them, a risky gambit given black's lurking knight and bishop. The rook's relocation to the first rank allows it to eye the crucial g2 pawn, a potential passed pawn that could become a real problem if white isn't careful. Crushing the pawn chain opens a devastating diagonal for the queen and a direct assault on black's vulnerable king. The pawn's storm on the queenside, once a formidable threat, now appears to be a strategic miscalculation, leaving black's king exposed in a way that could prove fatal. The rook's journey to the kingside offers a desperate attempt to dislodge the enemy king from its relatively safe outpost and create some breathing room on the open files. A desperate attempt to activate the passed pawn, even at the cost of abandoning it to the rook. The endgame beckons as the rook recaptures, initiating a stark positional confrontation focused on pawn advancement and the exposed enemy monarch. Black finally consolidates the passed pawn's advance, securing it with the bishop's support and preparing for a potential breakthrough into the white camp, a vital defensive resource now that the queens are off the board and the material is so drastically reduced. Promoting a queen here solidifies white's material advantage and creates immediate threats along the now open g-file, putting immense pressure on black's isolated bishop. Unleashing a queen sacrifice to secure a timely promotion, the black rook creates a cascade of threats across the board, aiming to exploit white's misplaced king and the exposed central pawns. The king ventures out from its protective pawn shield, a risky gambit to perhaps engage the opposition's powerful queen and rook. The queen's discovery across the board now forces white's king into an even more precarious situation, a consequence of its early venturing and the subsequent pawn sacrifice that opened up this diagonal. The king's journey across the board concludes its frantic dash to safety, finding a potentially precarious but vital outpost on g5, aiming to support the newly promoted queen and maintain pressure on black's vulnerable king. Clearing the air with a swift check, this forces the king out of its cozy corner, opening up new avenues of attack and potentially disrupting any carefully laid plans for white's monarch. The king cautiously advances, seeking refuge from the impending checks and aiming to become an active participant in the endgame's final skirmishes. Discovering a surprising check, the opponent now forces the king into a precarious dance. Navigating the perilous path to promotion, white decisively steps forward, aiming to shepherd the pawn's final advance through a minefield of black's counterplay and king activity. The black queen's unexpected flight checks the white king, forcing him into a less secure square and potentially disrupting white's plan to shelter his king behind the newly promoted queen. The white king cautiously retreats, seeking refuge from the relentless queen and bishop assault as the pawns on the 7th rank become a dangerous liability. Sacrificing material to expose the enemy king is a bold but risky strategy. Here, The queen swap eliminates immediate threats but opens the door for a devastating pawn push. Promoting the queen and creating an immediate mating threat on g8 completely shifts the dynamic, forcing black to react defensively and abandon any offensive aspirations. The finality of the mating net descends, a testament to capitalizing on the king's exposed position after a cascade of sacrifices and exchanges.